Okay, guys, so we are continuing on from the female reproductive system and jumping right into the menstrual cycle. So we're going to be looking at the different stages of the menstrual cycle, how different hormones fluctuate during the menstrual cycle, and the effect of those hormones. We're going to look at both the ovarian and uterine cycle and how they kind of mesh together. We're going to talk about how the ovum or the egg develops. And then we're also going to briefly talk about some negative feedback loops that help regulate the hormones in the menstrual cycle. So we'll start by just kind of talking about some of the different processes that can happen during the menstrual cycle. So oogenesis is the production of ova or eggs in the ovary. Ovulation is when that egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Usually only one at a time, though sometimes there can be more than one. That's how we get multiples like twins and triplets and stuff. Then we have fertilization, which is when the sperm burrows its way into the egg and the DNA from the sperm and egg are combined. That will happen in the fallopian tube. Then there's implantation, which is what happens when the developing zygote burrows its way into the endometrium, the inner layer of the uterus. Implantation then results in pregnancy as that embryo and then fetus further develops. If fertilization and implantation don't happen, instead of going that route, menstruation will occur instead, which is when the endometrium, that inner lining of the uterus, is shed. So the menstrual cycle is about 28 days. It does vary from woman to woman, but it averages about 28 days. It starts at the start of puberty and goes until menopause. And it just ensures that the egg or the ovum is released into the uterus or into the fallopian tube and then the uterus at a time when the uterus is ready for it, when it has a nice thick endometrium, for instance. So the main parts of the menstrual cycle are the follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, the luteal phase, and the flow phase. And we'll be talking about each of those in depth in this lesson. And this menstrual cycle is really a combination of two different cycles that are happening simultaneously. So the ovarian cycle describes all the changes that are happening inside the ovary. So what's happening to the eggs in there and all the different structures that support the eggs. And then the uterine cycle describes all the changes that's happening in the uterus. And again, these changes can be happening at the same time as each other. So when we're talking about the ovary, there is obviously eggs that are developing in there. And follicles are these specialized structures that surround the developing eggs. So at birth, every woman has about 2 million oocytes, which are immature eggs, inside follicles in the ovary. By puberty, a good chunk of those oocytes have actually degenerated and broken down, and you have on average about 400,000 left. And then each menstrual cycle, about 1,000 oocytes will start to develop. Only one will fully mature, and that'll be the one that is ovulated. And so that whole process of forming the oocyte from an unspecialized cell and then that oocyte maturing into an egg is all called oogenesis. And again, it's happening inside of structures called follicles in the ovary. Follicles are made up of two different types of cells. You have the cells of the granulosa, which is the layer around the outside that makes up the follicle wall and provides nutrients to the developing oocytes. And then you have the primary oocytes, which are the immature eggs themselves. So the first phase of the menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. What happens here is that the hypothalamus will release gonadotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary, and in this case causes the release of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. The FSH is then going to go to the ovary and stimulate the follicles to begin the process of oogenesis, so begin the maturation of the eggs. So during that process, the follicles essentially are going to get that signal from the follicle stimulating hormone, and the primary oocyte is going to undergo cell division. When that primary oocyte divides, it is going to form a secondary oocyte and something called the polar body. It'll be the first of 3 polar bodies. When that division happens, we go from the primary oocyte, which will have 46 chromosomes, to the secondary oocyte and the polar body, each of which have 23 chromosomes. However, while the division of chromosomes between those 2 structures is equal, the division of nutrients in cytoplasm is not. The primary oocyte will get almost all of the cytoplasm and organelles and all of that stuff, and the first polar body gets none. Then each of those structures, both the secondary oocyte and the first polar body, will both divide again. The polar body will divide into 2 more polar bodies. The secondary oocyte will develop into, will split into 1 polar body, and then essentially the egg that is going to develop. Meanwhile, the cells of the granulosa, which again make up the wall of the follicle, are going to divide and grow around this developing egg. As that happens, you will have a fluid-filled cavity that forms around the developing egg. By day 10, the follicle and the oocyte have completely matured. At that point, the follicle will be producing and secreting estrogen. The estrogen is then going to have 2 main functions. The first is that it acts in a negative feedback loop to go back and cut off the secretion of FSH from the anterior pituitary. And the second job of the estrogen is to actually stimulate the anterior pituitary to release LH, luteinizing hormone. And then over the next few days, that level of luteinizing hormone will build up until on day 14, we move into the ovulatory phase. The ovulatory phase happens just for 1 day on day 14 when the LH level is the highest. Essentially what happens is that the follicle is going to be stimulated by the LH to push against the wall of the ovary, which constricts blood flow to that section of ovary wall and weakens that section of the wall. Enzymes will also be secreted inside of the ovary and start breaking down the wall of the follicle. And over the course of that day, the wall of the follicle and that section of the wall of the ovary will burst because of all the weakening, and the egg will bust out of the ovary and flow on into the fallopian tube. After that, starting on day 15, we move into the luteal phase. At this point, you've just had ovulation happen, the egg has left the ovary, the follicle that was surrounding the egg is left behind. It's still in the ovary. And so that remaining area of follicle, all of those follicle cells that are left behind, develop into something called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum produces progesterone and a little bit of estrogen, but the progesterone is a really important part here. The progesterone is going to inhibit LH, just like the estrogen inhibits the FSH. And so you're not going to have any more ovulation happening. The progesterone is also going to go to the uterus and cause the vascularization of the endometrium. And what that means is it causes the endometrium, that inner layer of the uterus, to grow thick and blood-filled. A nice, thick, juicy endometrium. The progesterone also inhibits uterine contractions so that the uterus doesn't shake off some of that nice, thick, juicy endometrium. and it makes sure that the cervix is nice and firm as well. So this is kind of what most of this looks like. So we start up here with our undeveloped follicles. This would be at the very start of the menstrual cycle. And then when stimulated by FSH, those follicles are going to start developing. So this process right here, these kind of 3 follicles, show the development of the follicle and the maturation of the egg. So you can see that we're getting more cells of the granulosa and we are having that fluid-filled cavity develop. And then here where it says rupturing follicle, that's where ovulation would take place. So when stimulated by a spike in luteinizing hormone, the egg is able to bust out of the ovary. And then those remaining cells of the granulosa that were part of the follicle then develop into the corpus luteum, and that developing from leftover follicle to corpus luteum will be complete by day 20, so it takes about 5 days. And then by that day 20, you'll have lots of progesterone being produced and the uterine walls becoming prepared for implantation. It is important to note that all of these different structures that are shown in this diagram would not be found in the ovary at the same time. These are all happening at different days of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so while that's happening, while our corpus luteum is forming, the egg is traveling its way down the fallopian tube where fertilization would potentially happen. If fertilization happens, if the sperm and egg meet and their DNA combine, you'll have the formation of something called a zygote. And then that zygote, its cells are going to divide some more, and then eventually it is going to implant into the endometrium of the uterus. Again, by the time that that fertilized egg makes it to the uterus, the corpus luteum has had time to release lots of progesterone and make sure that the uterus is prepared for that fertilized egg. And then again, if implantation happens, if the woman becomes pregnant, the corpus luteum will stay there and will secrete hormones for the next 3 to 6 months. If, however, implantation does not happen, if there was no fertilization, the corpus luteum will degenerate into something called the corpus albicans. And the reason that that happens is that the corpus luteum requires LH in order to maintain its structure, or something similar to LH. But progesterone, which is being produced by the corpus luteum, cuts off the production of LH. So as soon as the progesterone levels get high, the LH gets cut off, and without the LH stimulating it, the corpus luteum will degenerate into the corpus albicans. Once the corpus luteum degenerates, the progesterone no longer gets released, and without the progesterone preventing uterine contractions, the uterus will start to contract. And it is those uterine contractions that cause the endometrium to slowly shed off of the inside of the uterus. It takes about 5 to 7 days, can be longer, can be shorter. But on average, that flow phase, which is the actual menstruation, the actual shedding of the endometrium, lasts about 5 to 7 days. And then at that point, the estrogen and progesterone levels will drop back down again, and the whole process will start over. Okay, so this is, on this side here, this white flow chart thing kind of shows how this is happening. I will draw out a flow chart as well to go over for this. But essentially at the top there, you have the hypothalamus releasing our gonadotropin releasing hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary and first causes the release of FSH. That's going to stimulate the growing follicle, which is going to not only cause the egg to develop, but also cause the production of estrogen. The estrogen then has a negative impact on the pituitary, cuts off the release of FSH. The estrogen also has a positive effect on the pituitary in that it stimulates the production and secretion of LH. The LH is firstly then going to go and cause ovulation to happen, and then it's also going to cause the left behind follicle to develop into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces progesterone and a little bit of estrogen. The progesterone, really important for making sure the uterus is fully developed and not contracting. And then the progesterone will also go back and cut off the secretion of LH from the pituitary. On the other side here, we just have a diagram that shows how both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are related. So if you look up at the top here, it's showing that this high spike of luteinizing hormone happens at day 14, which is when ovulation happens. You can also see that FSH is fairly high at the very beginning of the cycle, which is what stimulates the follicle to develop. You can also see that when the follicle is fully developed, that is when estrogen levels are highest, because remember, the follicle is producing estrogen. And you can see that when the corpus luteum is developing, that's when the progesterone levels are the highest. Once the corpus luteum breaks down again into the corpus albicans, that's when we have this big drop in progesterone at the end. The increase in progesterone corresponds with an increase in the thickness of the endometrium, and then the drop-off of the progesterone corresponds with the start of the flow phase, so the breakdown of the endometrium. These graphs, the graph at the top there, the blue one, that compares FSH and LH over the course of the menstrual cycle, and this kind of greenish, bluish graph that compares estrogen and progesterone over the course of the menstrual cycle. Both of those graphs are important to know, as is the entire flow chart. Okay, this is just another way of looking at this. So again, at the start, we have the follicular phase, which is stimulated by FSH, causing our follicles to develop, and those developing follicles are releasing the estrogen. And then you have LH here, which is causing ovulation, and then also causing the corpus luteum to develop. The corpus luteum is releasing progesterone and estrogen, the progesterone in particular causing this buildup of endometrium that we see in the yellow at the bottom. And then when the corpus albicans develop, because there's no more LH stimulating it, the development of the corpus albicans means that there's no more progesterone being produced, which means menstruation begins. So both FSH and LH are gonadotropins. We've talked about that before. They're both released from the anterior pituitary. And then FSH is responsible for ovary development, egg maturation, and estrogen production. LH is responsible for ovulation and progesterone production. And then both of those hormones are also released by the corpus luteum. Both of them have negative feedback loops that we've talked about. Again, all of that is stimulated by the hypothalamus releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone. Yeah, that's all stuff that we've talked about already. This is the one thing that we haven't really touched on in depth yet. So I've said that in order for the corpus luteum to maintain its shape and maintain its function, it has to be stimulated by LH or something similar to LH. And yet I've also said that the LH will be cut off fairly quickly because of the high levels of progesterone And I've also said that the corpus luteum will continue releasing progesterone into pregnancy. So if no pregnancy happens, the corpus luteum will break down into the corpus albicans. If implantation does happen and the woman becomes pregnant, instead there is another hormone that is going to take over the function of LH and continue stimulating the corpus luteum so that it doesn't degenerate. And that hormone is called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG for short. It will be released from the developing placenta as soon as implantation happens. And so yeah, HCG mimics luteinizing hormone. So the corpus luteum doesn't break down. It will keep releasing progesterone and make sure that the endometrium stays intact so that the embryo is able to develop there. So unlike in men that can continue producing sperm for their entire life, the ovaries do slowly decline starting right after the onset of puberty. And by the time a woman reaches menopause, there are very few follicles left in the ovary, and ovulation will stop at that point, and then hormones will drop off because we don't have this entire menstrual cycle regulating hormones anymore. Older women who do get pregnant have a higher chance of having a child with genetic defects, which has been linked to follicle age. Essentially, older follicles are just more likely to have damaged DNA in their ovum. The change in hormone production that happens during menopause is what causes all the symptoms of menopause, from affecting mood to hot flashes to weight gain because of slower metabolism to insomnia and all that kind of stuff. So I'll stop there for a moment, and then I'm going to create a flow chart for you guys, trying to kind of summarize everything that's happening here. Okay, so just like most hormones, all of this is going to start in the hypothalamus, which is what that says. The hypothalamus then releases gonadotropin releasing hormone that is going to go to the anterior pituitary. In this case, it causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH. That FSH is going to go to the ovary, specifically the follicle in the ovary, and cause that follicle to start developing and the egg to start developing. So it causes the egg to slowly mature. Okay. That developing follicle is also going to be releasing estrogen. That estrogen is then going to go back and cut off the production of FSH. The estrogen is also going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause the release of LH. The LH is going to do two things. First of all, it's going to cause ovulation. So the release of the mature egg from the ovary. And then second of all, it's going to cause the development of the corpus luteum, which is what the remaining follicle turns into after the egg is ovulated. The corpus luteum is then going to release a little bit of estrogen, but a lot of progesterone. And that progesterone is going to do a couple things. It is going to vascularize the endometrium. just get the endometrium nice and thick and juicy and ready for that egg to implant. It's also going to prevent uterine contractions. So that the endometrium is not shed. That increase in progesterone is then going to go back and cut off the LH. With the LH no longer there, the corpus luteum is going to turn into a corpus albicans. Okay, so once that cutoff happens and there's no more LH, that is when the corpus luteum turns into the corpus albicans. At that point, there is no more progesterone being released, which is going to cause uterine contractions, which will cause the endometrium to be shed. The only thing that can prevent this process from happening is if there is implantation of a fertilized egg, in which case HCG will get released and it will stimulate the corpus luteum to continue doing all of these things. Okay. So what we have here, this section over here is the flow phase. This is the ovulatory phase. This is the luteal phase. And this last section is the flow phase. So sorry, just to repeat that because I feel like I might have named this one wrong. This is the follicular phase, ovulatory phase, luteal phase, and then the flow phase. And again, the only thing that prevents the flow phase is pregnancy, which will just keep this luteal phase going. Okay, and that is a summary of the menstrual cycle.